he specifically leads Israel over to a place where they'll have to depend on God. They're going to be trapped by Pharaoh's army. And it's not, oh, God's sitting there, oh, what do I do now?
Right.
No. God specifically leads Israel into a spot where they're going to be caught between Pharaoh's army and the sea. Hi, and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. And today we're going to deal with a topic that is quite interesting. It's the idea that what happens when someone who has seen God work in their lives and has seen God work in the lives of those around them, and God has then delivered them from sin. What happens if they have a desire to go back?
Yeah.
What happens if you have a desire to go back? And Steve, is it ever the case where people are delivered from sin, but then have a desire to go back?
Yeah, and a lot of times what happens is the desire comes whenever they're confronted with sin. Maybe it is the sin that they've actually, the main sin that they've been delivered from. Could be just sin in general, though. And so we'll see a little bit in regards to how Israel reacted today in our session, and then we'll apply that and be able to apply to some of the things in our life, I think.
Right. And so we're in the book of Exodus. And so if you have your Bibles, turn to Exodus chapter 13, starting in verse 17. And with that, we have here, again, this point in our story, God is leading Israel out of Egypt, and he has destroyed the firstborn son, and he is now leading them out. And so I'll start reading here in Exodus 13, starting in verse 17. Now, when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them away by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God said the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Hence God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in a martial array from the land of Egypt. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones from here with you. Then they set out from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. The Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. And so, Steve, even in this brief little passage, we have several gold nuggets. Israel, again, had just come out of slavery and were not prepared for war. And what it says here is they didn't take them through the land of the Philistines. And by that, what he's meaning is the shortest way, the easiest way, would be to go north towards the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. But there were peoples there.
Right.
And they would have been immediately into war. And the people of Israel had been slaves for all these years. They weren't really soldiers. They weren't warriors.
No, and also it was the main road that went to the land of Canaan, the nation of Canaan there. And so it had also been fortified by Egypt because it was a main thoroughfare. So if they would have gone that way, they would have encountered probably, the outposts, Egyptian outposts pretty quick.
So if we were to ask the question of what does this tell us? What it tells me is that God's gracious.
Yeah.
He has our best interest in mind. He may lead us into a wilderness, but it's really the best way. Okay, how come we don't go on that nice smooth road up there that's right by the ocean, got a nice view, watch the sunset? Well, God, you're leading me out here into this wilderness.
Yeah.
No, that other way may look nice, but there's disaster there, and I'm leading you out the best way. And so to me, it shows God's grace here that he's actually leading Israel in the best way so they don't end up in war, even though to Israel, the safe, smooth, nice, pretty way, it sure looks nice. But God says, no, there's disaster on that road. Let's go this way. God is always gracious and has our best interest in mind. And he could have delivered them through some miracle. You know, we've seen all these miracles.
Yeah.
God could have divinely decreed that the Philistines move out of the way, kept them, done some miracle. But I submit, Steve, that God doesn't always work like that. He doesn't do these miracles just for the sake of being nice to people. I mean, even over in the New Testament, yes, Jesus had compassion, surely, on people when he healed them. And part of it, okay, I'll grant you, he did out of compassion, but that's not the main reason why Jesus did healing miracles. It's not the main reason why God was doing all these plague miracles back here in Exodus. He did it because he's showing his glory.
Right, and the actual miracle that he delivers them through is more miraculous than doing what you were talking about, taking them on that road and maybe forcing their way through that. The way that he does that, which we'll see here, is actually something that's many more elements to it that are miraculous elements.
Right. And it says here in verse 18 that they marched in an orderly fashion. I think our translations here has martial array, which is a sort of odd phrasing, but it's really saying an orderly fashion. And to me, that says that God does things in a orderly way. He does things in an orderly way. It also tells us that in this march, it's not just mass chaos. It's not just mass confusion. They're marching in an orderly fashion. Now, I also want to stop for a second because right here in verse 18, it talks about the Red Sea. So that gives us a chance to answer a question. And of course, here it says Red Sea. And as Steve's held there, literally sea of reeds. And so the initial term there literally means sea of reeds. But the language scholars have almost universally translated it Red Sea. And the reason why is because all the ancient documents, whenever there was a translation, always translated it Red Sea. But what ends up happening in English, when at least in our day, in our country, when people hear, oh, Red Sea really means sea of reeds, they think, oh, that's a swamp, that it's some sort of a marsh or sea of what is papyrus reeds is what it was actually speaking of, because those would grow along the shoreline. And so this term leads some skeptics and some even Christians that are looking for a way to deny a miracle to say, oh, well, when Israel crossed the Red Sea, they were really crossing the Reed Sea, and really it was some sort of a marsh or a swamp. And people actually look for ways to explain through some natural occurrence the Exodus and the crossing through the Red Sea. And so that's why we bring this up. It's not just a language translation issue. So Steve, before I give an answer, what's your take on this whole idea of Israel crossing through the Red Sea or the Reed Sea? What was it? Was it a swamp or a marsh?
Well, no. I mean, a little bit later, we're going to see that the entire Egyptian army that went out there is drowned by the collapse of this area that they crossed over. So if it was a swamp or something else like that, it's pretty hard to drown an entire army in a swampy area.
And so I don't know how many times I've heard people say, oh, well, they were going along the shore and the tide went out and Israel crossed and then the tide came back in and did that. Or another argument was, oh, there was this land bridge that was like barely under the water, and when the water level goes down or the tide went down a little bit, then Israel had a land bridge, and then the tide comes back in and Pharaoh drove off the edge of the land bridge. And all this, it's just nonsense that are grasping at straws, trying to come up with an excuse to avoid what the text clearly says, which is a miracle. And from this, I will submit not only what you just said, okay, if it was some sort of a swamp or something, or Pharaoh's greatest army in the world at the time is supposed to not know enough on how to not drive off in the water, Over
Right.
in 1 Kings 9:26, the same term is used, the same Hebrew term that's translated Red Sea, or even, if you will, Sea of Reeds. But in 1 Kings 9:26, King Solomon had a fleet of ships on the Red Sea. And he had a port with a whole fleet that was on this Sea of Reeds. And so it's not a swamp. Pharaoh's not so foolish as to drive off and to destroy his entire army, driving off into because or not understand the tides. And this is just completely ridiculous.
Solomon didn't have a swamp fleet.
So, didn't have no, and so the language scholars had it right simply because all the places where the ancient translators translated into Red Sea, and it's not a misunderstanding, and it wasn't some sort of natural occurrence. And when we get to the next chapter, we're going to see there were walls of water on each side, and God did additional miracles in there. And so it really happened just as it said.
Well, and also you don't hear them making an account in regard to this pillar of smoke during the day, pillar of fire at night that didn't go away. I haven't at least heard things. I've heard all those stories or read all those accountings to take it away. I haven't particularly read any type of accountings to explain this protection that God had of these pillars of fire. The pillars of smoke and the fire. And you think about that. Yes, through nature, you see tornadoes and big storms that come up, and they kind of have form, kind of like a mushroom type of a deal. But again, this is something that goes the whole time that they're out going into the wilderness and escape from here. So it's not just a weather event that comes across, number one. Number two is at nighttime. It's a fire or brings light to them at nighttime so that they can travel both during the day and the night. And so while you'll see these depictions of what you're talking about to try and naturally explain away this crossing that the Israelites go through, I haven't seen anything of trying to explain what these pillars are and stuff. So again, it's selectively trying to pick apart. And I think their thinking is if we can pick one thing apart, then we can prove that the other stuff wasn't true at all either.
And part of it, I think, Steve, is because they just don't read the text. And they've heard the story, Israel crossed the Red Sea, and that's as far as it goes. If they'd actually pull out the book and read it, then they might have a little more intelligent criticisms.
Yep.
But moving on to verse 19, there's a more important thing here. In verse 19, it says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, God will surely take care of you. You shall carry my bones from here with you. So that takes us all the way back to Genesis, when Joseph originally came, and there's a whole story of Joseph and his brothers, and he eventually, there's a whole story around that.
It was over 500 years.
500 years. And at the end of Exodus, what happened? What was the promise? What did Joseph request at the end of Genesis?
Joseph says, God is surely going to take care of you, talking about the nation itself, and take you back to the land that he's promised. And so therefore, promise me that you're going to take my bones as well. So it's a depiction of Joseph's faith and belief in God and what he had promised them as a nation to take them back to the land by declaring, take my bones with you whenever you go, because it's going to be a sure thing. It's going to happen. And then of course, hundreds of years later, it does happen.
And so that answers my next discussion question, which was, why would Joseph want his bones brought back? Well, because he knew that God's going to lead you out of here. And I submit there's an additional answer in the sense that Joseph believed in resurrection. Joseph believed in physical bodily resurrection. If it was the case that Joseph believed, we're just going to die and our body's going to disintegrate and is never going to be seen again, and it's all just going to turn to dust, and really we're all going to be spirits in heaven, we're going to be ghosts floating around heaven, he wouldn't have cared. if the earth was going to be completely destroyed and he was never going to have a physical bodily resurrection, and all he believed in was a spiritual resurrection in heaven, then he wouldn't have made this request. Joseph believed in physical bodily resurrection, and he didn't want to rise in Egypt. He wanted to rise in his native country. And so I see this as a very clear support that all the way back here in Genesis, people believed in resurrection. And I mean, over in 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul just hammers it over and over again. It is raised, it is raised, it is raised. And so physical bodily resurrection of everyone is taught thoroughly and completely throughout the scriptures. And that's why Christians have always honored the body in burial. It's because we believe in resurrection. And so then in verses 21 and 22, it introduces this pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night. And so, Steve, you had alluded to that already. But again, it says here, the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so what does this tell us? That there's this whole idea of clouds and fire. You've alluded to some of it, but what's the significance here? Besides the fact that, okay, it's this cloud is moving around protecting them and giving them light. Yeah. What does this speak to? What's the significance of this? Because I see it as quite profound.
Yeah, well, on the surface, it's God taking care of protecting the nation itself. He's personally involved in regards to what's going on.
Right. And I see this right here at the end of Exodus 13. We are introduced to this cloud and God appearing as a cloud. And that theme is a major theme that's picked up throughout the entire rest of the Bible, all the way in throughout the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament, all the way through into the future kingdom, is God being associated with a cloud and being associated with a bright light or fire. And they describe it as fire. I mean, there was already the burning bush that was a fire that was bright, but it wasn't consuming the bush. But right here, we have the cloud and the fire. And I'm going to give you a list here, just try to go through this real quickly to kind of give you a big picture of how important this is. But right here it starts. The clouds appear here, and it's leading them. And we're going to see a little more as we go who that is and what that means. The clouds are going to appear again on the top of Mount Sinai. And remember, there was thunder and lightnings and clouds on top of Mount Sinai. The cloud continues to lead them through the 40 years of wilderness travel. The cloud would lead them, and when the cloud stopped, they would stop. They would set up the tabernacle, which was the worship tent, and then the cloud would hover over the Holy of Holies. Mm-hmm. And whenever Moses would go in to speak to God, the cloud would descend into the worship tent, and the light would be there as well. When Moses came out, what happened to his face?
Well, it's shown as a glory of so bright that they ended up putting a veil over him.
Right, and that was because this glory, this cloud of glory, was physically in the tent. And so again, and then the cloud would pick up, and they'd say, "Oh, now it's time to move." They would pack up the tabernacle and start following the cloud. So for 40 years, this cloud led them through the wilderness, would tell them when to stop, when to go. When Moses would go in to speak, the cloud would be there. The later, continuing on into history, Solomon, over in the time of the kings, Solomon builds the first temple. Instead of the tent, the tabernacle tent, he wanted to build a building. David wanted to build a building. Solomon actually builds it. And in 1 Kings 8, specifically starting at verse 10, is the consecration ceremony for the original first temple. And in 1 Kings 8, when they dedicated the temple, they bring in the most sacred objects, the Ark of the Covenant. The cloud comes in. And it says in 1 Kings 8, the cloud entered so much that it was so thick that and so heavy on them that the priest couldn't keep doing the ceremonies. So this cloud led them through the wilderness for 40 years. Centuries later, the cloud's still there. When they set up the temple, the cloud comes in when they dedicate the temple and is a physical representation of the Lord God. Israel then disobeys over time. And in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, the entire chapter 1 of Ezekiel, God shows up in a cloud. And in Ezekiel chapter 10, to show God's judgment on Israel, the cloud lifts up, goes out of the temple area, out to the edge of Israel, out to the Mount of Olives. Okay? The glory of God leaves Israel because of their disobedience. He goes out to the Mount of Olives. Okay? Centuries go by. Who in the New Testament is the glory of God?
Jesus is.
Jesus is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus starts at the Mount of Olives, goes back into the temple in the crucifixion week, and is again rejected. Okay, so the glory of God returned to the temple in Jesus' day, and he's rejected again. Where does he ascend from in the first chapter of Acts?
From the Mount of
Mount
Olives.
of Olives.
Yeah.
So the glory goes out of the temple back up to the Mount of Olives, and in Acts 1, he rises into a cloud. Right? He goes
Right.
back into a cloud.
That's right.
In the end days, it tells us that Jesus will arrive on a
Cloud.
and we're going to meet him in the clouds, to meet him in the air.
Right.
And in the book of Zechariah, specifically chapter 14, Messiah will come back, and it's very clear there, lay his feet down on the Mount of Olives. And so this idea of a cloud, even on into Revelation, it talks about clouds. And so right all the way back here in Exodus, chapter 13 is where all that begins. And this theme carries its way all the way through the scriptures, and it starts right here. And I just find this story to be very ignored, one, by Bible teachers, but I find it to be very key, because God appearing in a cloud and appearing as fire, as kind of a glowing light, is a major theme in the scriptures. Now, all of that will continue on. That takes us down to the end of chapter 13. And so, Steve, in chapter 14, what do we have here? The first 4 verses lead us into these locations where they're going to be going. And so, Steve, can you just read the first 4 verses of chapter 14?
Yes. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal Zephon, opposite by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And they did so.
Okay, so what do we get from this, Steve? First of all, the specific places here were sort of lost to
Thanks for letting me read those verses,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah, exercise in pronunciation.
Well, we see that God has a strategy, right? He's the one that comes up with this strategy in order to entice Pharaoh to come in. And so, we've heard from others, and we read that, the Israelites were looting whenever they left Egypt. And so because they were looting, that's why Pharaoh pursued them. And no, that's not the case. We see right here that God purposefully has them go and stop in the direction that they're going and turn back a little bit in order to entice Pharaoh that, hey, they've lost their way and they're in the wilderness, and so therefore they're vulnerable and we can go and attack them.
And I find that to be quite true, Steve. What you're saying is that God is leading them.
Right.
This isn't randomness. And he's not saying, okay, you guys go figure it out on your own. No, he's leading them to specific places. And he's actually leading them. It says there in verse 2, as you said, turn back. So they had been going, and he says, no, turn.
Right.
And these places where it takes them, look at verse 2, between this Migdol and the sea,
Yeah.
you shall camp in front opposite by the sea.
And this is the sea that they're going to cross.
Right.
Yeah, so it's kind of like he's setting it up for Pharaoh that they're out there and they're trapped. They've got the sea on one side that they're not going to be able to cross, or so he thinks. And if we come down, we can trap them and we can put them in and overtake them because they won't have a way out.
So I see something very profound here. God is specifically leading these people into a trap.
Right.
He is specifically leading them to where they've got the sea on one side and specifically leading them there, knowing with certainty what Pharaoh is thinking and what he will do with certainty. And so he specifically leads Israel over to a place where they'll have to depend on God. They're going to be trapped by Pharaoh's army. And it's not, oh, God's sitting there, oh, what do I do now?
Right.
No. God knows exactly what Pharaoh is thinking, and he knows exactly what Pharaoh is going to freely decide to do. And God specifically leads Israel into a spot where they're going to be caught between Pharaoh's army and the sea.
And in verse 4, God specifically says, here's the reason why. He says, so I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army. Now, as we read through, we see that his army is destroyed. And that's how God is bringing honor to himself, is that through this crossing and what happens to Pharaoh's army and utter destruction, God is honored and glorified through all of that.
So here's a question, Steve. We know the end of the story.
Right.
Because we read this before.
That's right.
But the people of Israel that were first going through this, they didn't know that.
No.
All they know is, hey, God's leading us, and now we're in a spot.
In the next verses, we're going to see what their reaction is.
Right. In the next verses, we're going to see what their reaction is. But the main thing here is God is not leading them aimlessly.
Correct.
God is leading them in a specific location for a specific purpose to glorify himself. Right?
So Glenn, I'll ask you a question as you like to do. Does God lead us aimlessly throughout our lives?
He leads us, but it's not aimlessly. Now, if I try to put myself in the shoes of Israel here, I might think, what in the world is God thinking? This is militarily like the worst spot you could be in. Surely Moses messed us up, or somehow the board of deacons made a mistake here. We need to call a meeting and have a new vote on a new pastor or something, because we're in a real bad spot here, and we were going over here, and now they want us to back up and go somewhere else. If I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the people of Israel here, this doesn't make any sense at all. But God is in control, and he is specifically leading them into a spot, not for Israel's glory,
right,
for his glory. And so the answer is yes. God does this today to us. Are there times where we get in a spot where we say, oh my goodness, what in the world is God thinking? There's a really clear path of where I think we ought to go, and God's not leading me there. And this is militarily in a really bad spot, but there's a purpose here, and God always has a purpose. He is not doing this aimlessly. And in verse 3, he knows with certainty what Pharaoh is thinking and what he's going to do. And again, in verse 4, the word harden means strengthen. So God is saying, I will strengthen Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh will do what he wants to do, and God can make an example out of him. And so Pharaoh has been letting Israel go reluctantly, but he still wants them back. I mean,
Right.
God had to basically force his hand so that we could get his people out of there, Israel. Now Pharaoh is having second thoughts and wants
Right.
them back. And so, any other thoughts on that, Steve? Before we go, that's all I had for this. And it's probably a good spot to kind of stop for the day.
I don't, other than that we led this off talking about how confronting sin sometimes leads us back, and we'll really pick that up in the next session.
Okay. And so that's what we do here, is do verse by verse, and it takes us where it takes us. And so we hope that you'll be back with us next time as we will continue to reason through the Bible.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and may God bless you.